to Rome. He inherited a vast empire, unimaginable wealth, and the love of his people. He threw them all away. He butchered his enemies and his closest friends. According to the ancient texts, his reign descended into paranoia, depravity, and full-blown insanity. He's painted as a monster, a movie villain, yet he was a real person. By pairing the latest archaeological findings with a forensic psychiatrist's report, we now build a new picture of Rome's darkest days and its most terrifying mind. The mind of Caligula. Rome is a city built by great men. Men who have power and wealth on a scale we can barely conceive of. They use it to win immortality. They conquer foreign lands. They build grand monuments. They work to ensure that their names will always be remembered and revered. Caligula is different. Caligula's 4-year reign as emperor is so disastrous that his successors seek to wipe out all traces of him. His family is butchered, even his statues torn down.
This piece was fished out of the Tiber River, discarded ultimately, and that's probably why it survives, because the public ones were defaced, or thrown away, or recarved. This is Caligula, one of the most notorious emperors in all of Roman history.
Caligula wins his fame with cruelty, debauchery, and excess.
The stories that surround his brief reign are fantastic. He's a monster. He's perverse. It's hard to separate fact from fiction.
Generations of historians have sifted through the documentary records to try and build a picture of this man. Was he simply evil? Was he insane? Now, psychiatrist Elizabeth Ford is going to try to find an answer.
I'm a forensic psychiatrist, which essentially means that I have special training in dealing with any kinds of issues related to psychiatry or mental health and the law.
Dr. Ford's work brings her face to face with men accused of the worst, most violent crimes. When the law wants to know if a person's capable of separating right from wrong, she's called as an expert witness.
So the question is often couched, is the person mad or is the person bad? And the people who are labeled bad are so extraordinarily bad, and they're so far off the norm from anything else that we see in society, that I think it's a tough sell to say that there's not some kind of mental health component going on there. There's been data that shows, for example, that psychopaths, who are sort of the ones commonly equated with the bad, actually have abnormalities in their brain.
Even though Caligula died 2,000 years ago, even though the details of his life are obscured by myth and exaggeration, Dr. Ford can still attempt a diagnosis.
Evaluation of someone like Caligula certainly would pose significant difficulties, given that it's impossible to examine him. He's been dead for a long time. And so we're limited in the ability to really clearly diagnose him, although I certainly think there are things we can say about his personality and potentially his psychiatric illness from what we do know.
One thing we know is that Caligula's reign started in a blaze of glory. When he arrived in Rome in 37 AD, the crowds gave him a rapturous welcome, even though he'd done nothing to earn it.
Before he became emperor, it's probably fair to say that very, very few Romans had met Caligula.
For 7 years, he'd been out of sight on the remote island of Capri. He'd been kept a virtual prisoner by his aging and reclusive uncle, the Emperor Tiberius. He knew little of the city, and the city knew little of him.
But even though Romans hadn't met him, they did hold Caligula in enormous affection, and the reason for that was that he was the only surviving son of Germanicus.
Caligula's father had died young. The legacy he left his son was the people's love. Germanicus was one of Rome's idols, an example of manhood and virtue, a genuine, all-conquering military hero. Caligula spent his early years watching the mob heap praise upon him.
The Romans believed very, very strongly that sons inherited their father's qualities. And so all of these strong attributes that people associated with Germanicus were naturally transferred to Caligula.
Caligula returned to Rome a man. He had the people's backing. He was the emperor's nominated successor. But he could not take the throne without one more thing. He had to win the backing of the Senate. These were the early years of the empire. The days when Rome had been a republic were within living memory. Two emperors, first Augustus, then Tiberius, had built their power slowly, carefully. In theory, all authority was handed to them by this body, an unelected elite drawn largely from the city's great families. Each man here has his own wealth and his own networks of influence. They are politicians, generals, diplomats, seasoned fighters who've traveled the world in the name of Rome. Now Caligula must persuade them to place everything, even their lives, in his hands.
Now the Senate has realized that it needs an emperor, but the emperor also knows that he needs the Senate. And Caligula is not quite 25. He's about to meet the 500 most powerful men in the world. These were the people who could make or break his reign, and he was not prepared for this. He hadn't had experience of politics.
He needed the senators' support. He also knew that any rival would come from among their ranks.
Tiberius compared the job of being emperor to like holding a wolf by the ears. You cling to its back, clinging on for dear life. If you fall, you will be savaged. The Senate are the head of that wolf. How he played this scene would affect the tone of his entire reign.
What the senators feared most was tyranny, that they'd hand over absolute power, then be at the mercy of the man who wields it. Caligula convinced them they were safe.
Caligula plays the scene perfectly. He stands before them and says, I will behave as if I'm your son. I will behave as if I am your ward. I will treat you with honor, with respect. This was just what they wanted to hear. So in a matter of hours, they voted him all the powers that other emperors had taken years to acquire.
It is a decision which changes the balance of power forever, and it proves disastrous.
A remarkable thing happened. The Senate conferred essentially absolute power on him. It's the first time this had happened in Roman history.
At a stroke, Caligula becomes the most powerful man who has ever lived. He has the power of life or death over 55 million people. Lands covering 2 million square miles.
Caligula, with no training or proper preparation at the age of 25, is suddenly made to feel that he is the center of the universe with unlimited powers. And this must have created in him an overwhelming sense of his destiny.
Taxes are abolished. Political prisoners pardoned. It's said that during 3 months of public rejoicing to usher in Caligula's reign, more than 160,000 animals are sacrificed. Then, suddenly, everything changes. In October 37 AD, 6 months after his coronation, Caligula falls ill and disappears from view. When he emerges, it is as a changed man. and Rome's nightmare begins. In his first few months as emperor, Caligula is hugely popular. But then he suddenly disappears from view. It's suggested he falls dangerously ill.
People seem to have been convinced that Caligula would die, and we don't know how long it lasted, but it does seem to have lasted a considerable time.
Nobody knows exactly what happened, but the accounts suggest that Caligula was transformed. One simply says that he emerges a monster.
We get the sense of someone who lost his sense of reality, who became increasingly crazed and increasingly vicious and tyrannical.
From the imperial palace on the hill above the forum, strange rumors start to be heard. That Caligula no longer sleeps. That he's taken to drinking excessively. There are tales of sexual debauchery, of violent rages and sudden mood swings. Then comes public behavior which can only be called bizarre. In what becomes one of the most famous of all the stories about Caligula, it's said he gives the most powerful job in the Senate, the role of consul, to his favorite horse.
He actually built for him on the Palatine Hill a stable made of marble, and he gave him a trough made of ivory. And to top it all off, he would invite people to have dinner with the horse.
If he treated his horse as if a human, talked to the horse as if a human, and had allegedly intended to make that horse a senator, is psychotic. I don't know of any culture where that wouldn't be.
At this point, historians point out that with Caligula, it's hard to separate fact from fiction. The written accounts are few, and they do concentrate on the most colourful details.
We have to rely on accounts that are racy, entertaining, but unreliable. And it's almost as if we were trying to reconstruct the history of the 21st century, and the National Enquirer was the only piece of documentary evidence that had survived.
But in the immediate aftermath of Caligula's illness, some facts speak for themselves.
One of the sources says that many people paid for the illness with their lives.
Caligula begins killing. He accuses his father-in-law of plotting against him and forces him to commit suicide. His cousin, his most likely heir, meets the same fate. The ancient accounts suggest that the illness was the trigger, that it somehow warped Caligula's mind. But what sort of medical diagnosis could possibly account for it? Some people have found an answer by studying Caligula's family tree.
There's a pretty remarkable history of epilepsy in his particular family. Julius Caesar was known to have epilepsy. His maternal grandmother and his sister also had epilepsy. He certainly had a history of epilepsy as a child. Not clear that persisted into adulthood, but there was something medically going on, and I'm assuming that seizures were part of that, either witnessed or not.
Epilepsy could explain why the events surrounding the illness are shrouded in secrecy. It's regarded as a shameful disease in Roman times. And there's one form of it, temporal lobe epilepsy, which can trigger psychiatric disturbance. In particular, it can cause the sufferer to confuse what's real and what's not, the psychotic state that the ancient accounts hint at. As time goes on, his erratic behavior becomes more pronounced. Caligula is the most powerful man on earth, But in his own mind, he's becoming more than that. He seems to believe that he's turning into a god. First, he's seen in the temples, talking to statues.
There are some wonderful stories about Caligula going to consult with the statue of Jupiter. He goes into the temple of Jupiter and kind of stands next to the statue and has a conversation with it.
Then he decides to share the news of his immortality with the wider world.
These 3 columns are all that remains of the very impressive temple of Castor and Pollux. These are the sons of the god Jupiter, the king of the gods. And Caligula, according to the Roman historian Suetonius, appears in the temple as Jupiter. And he's asking the people in the Roman Forum, come and venerate me. I am the living God.
He goes further. He hatches a plan which will trample on centuries of tradition.
He's going to build a bridge from his residence on the Palatine Hill all the way over to the Capitoline Hill so he can commune with the king of the gods.
The imperial architects are consulted, plans drawn up. Not for the last time, Caligula intends to blow vast resources, men, money, materials, on a scheme which defies logic. And no one tries to stop him. But why this particular obsession with gods and immortality? The answer may lie in what happened in Caligula's childhood, in one particular event, and in the example set by his father, Germanicus. Germanicus was a national hero, a beloved general, the darling of the crowd.
Typically in children who have a parental figure who looms large will go in 2 different paths. They'll try to emulate that person and overpass them in terms of grandiosity and power and prestige, or they will really desperately underachieve so that there is no competition with that parental figure. I think in Caligula's case, he may have gone the former path.
In his early years, Caligula was never far from his father's side. He even joined him on military campaigns.
We're told that his mother dressed him up in a little soldier's uniform, and he became a kind of mascot of the troops. And that's where he got his name. Caligula in Latin means little boot.
Caligula had seen his father's glory. But it seems he wanted to go better. He rode with Germanicus when Germanicus was awarded a triumph, a formal victory procession through the city streets. As was the custom, and as a counter to the chorus of approval from the mob, a slave stood behind him whispering over and over the words, "Remember, you are mortal." Germanicus had risen as high in Rome as any human could.
A 7-year-old is not old enough to differentiate between somebody who thinks they're a god or is being told they're a god and somebody who actually is a god. So that would be both exhilarating and possibly quite confusing for Caligula.
Germanicus won wars, but he was no emperor. Caligula, untested, has the throne, and so he has a point to prove.
He's superior to the Senate. He's different from them. Who can he associate with if not the gods themselves?
This is a man whose ambition has no limits, whose authority has no brakes. Unless someone stops him, he will bring the city to ruin. Accounts of Caligula's reign are full of outrageous, impractical and unfinished projects. Little physical evidence survives, but 20 miles south of Rome, a volcanic lake has offered up something extraordinary. Lake Nemi, home to a mysterious cult said to worship the goddess Diana and practice human sacrifice. The locals have always believed that Caligula left something here, on the lake bed.
ancient sources, local myth, and the fact that local fishermen had been dragging things off the lake bed had indicated that there was something really special beneath the waters of the lake. So in the 1930s, Mussolini determined that he was going to find out what was there, and in order to do so, he drained the lake of all 8 billion gallons of water.
Mussolini's engineers could use ancient channels to do the job. Man-made passages here predate even Caligula's time.
This is a huge tunnel that's been cut through the hill that runs up to the edge of the lake. And effectively it acted as an enormous overflow, monitoring the levels of the lake. There are even slots for a series of sluice gates that would have controlled the flow of water.
As the waters receded, a remarkably preserved structure emerged from the mud. It was the keel and ribs of a boat.
A large pleasure boat was discovered on a truly opulent and magnificent scale, and on the basis of inscribed pipes, these have been attributed to Caligula.
In fact, there were 2 boats, a palace and a floating temple. Their keels no longer survive. They were destroyed in the Second World War, so only a full-scale replica can convey their size.
It's over 230 feet in length, which makes it twice the size of any merchantman that we've excavated from the Mediterranean, and twice the size of any warship. And all for the pleasure of Caligula.
The building of these boats seems eccentric. But people said that his next project was an act of out-and-out madness. The venue was the mouth of the Bay of Naples and the port town of Puteoli.
Behind me is the Bay of Pozzuoli, and in Caligula's time this would have been the centre of maritime Roman activities. Grain ships would have been arriving from North Africa. This was where Rome and the Roman Empire met.
Constant traffic in and out of the ports is essential to Rome's survival. If the grain doesn't flow, the people starve. But it seems Caligula doesn't care.
Caligula ordered that pairs of boats be anchored up and filled with earth. On top of it, he constructed a road. It stretched from here 2 miles across to the other side of the Bay of Pozzuoli. And for 3 days he rode up and down it on his horse.
This stunt brings massive disruption to the Roman economy. But Caligula has chosen his site deliberately, and he isn't concerned with the grain ships or the port. What interests him are the grand houses beyond.
The hills and the shores of the bay behind me would have been covered with the villas of the great and good of Rome. For Caligula, this was his theatre. The bridge was his stage, and they were his audience. He was essentially saying to them, I can do anything I want.
The Senate has given Caligula absolute power, but he will never be satisfied that he has truly proved his supremacy. The senators will learn this to their cost. He makes them suffer for his own insecurities. It's said that this entire episode, this vast deployment, and all the chaos it brings, is sparked by a single insulting remark.
There was a school of thought which claimed that Tiberius's astrologer had said that Caligula could no more reign than he could walk over the ocean to Baiae.
Caligula's response, out of all sane proportion, seems to typify an aspect of his character. In everything he does, there is extraordinary energy, a frenzy of activity. Elizabeth Ford sees a possible medical explanation. It's a diagnosis of bipolar disorder, once called manic depression.
So when one is manic, oftentimes they are very fun to be around. They're thoughtful, generous, creative, ideas just pouring out of them. And that includes things that sometimes they can't actually accomplish. But the belief and the grandiosity is there to make them think, I can do these great, miraculous things in a short period of time. And because I'm charismatic and very happy and people want to be around me, I can marshal other people's forces to help me with that.
A manic state could be behind much of Caligula's strange behavior.
A particular person may have psychotic symptoms, and that can run the gamut from delusions to hallucinations, hearing voices, to paranoia.
The picture that's emerging is of a man who is increasingly unpredictable, still magnetic, but manic and dangerous. Caligula's reign gets steadily more violent. His prime target is the aristocracy. He needs only the slightest provocation to order the death of an individual or a whole family.
There's a wonderful story about how Caligula's sitting at dinner with some fellow senators, and he suddenly starts laughing. They ask him, what the joke is, and he says the joke is, if I wanted to, I could have you all killed.
So where does this paranoia come from?
It's certainly possible that he suffered from a personality disorder that was characterized by paranoia. And that would explain a lot of his rejection sensitivity, a lot of his killings that were a result of feeling like people were trying to harm him or were not thinking kindly of him.
In a case like this, Dr. Ford might normally look for a trigger, a psychological trauma in a subject's past. With Caligula, she doesn't have to look far.
There are many things in Caligula's development that would make him think that his life was in danger and that people were trying to kill him or plotting to kill him.
It begins early. He's just 7 years old when Germanicus, his father, dies. The circumstances are suspicious.
He was posted to the east, and he died of a mysterious illness while he was there, and there's a whole question about whether he was poisoned or not.
Many see the hand of the emperor himself.
There was a widespread belief among the populace of Rome that Tiberius had engineered the poisoning of Germanicus.
Tiberius had certainly destroyed Caligula's mother, Agrippina. He'd accused her of plotting against him, then sent her into exile. She killed herself. And Tiberius wasn't finished. Caligula was the youngest of 3 brothers.
His 2 older brothers, Nero and Drusus, who were obvious possible candidates to take over the empire, both met unfortunate ends. Nero was accused of treason and disposed of, and Drusus seems to have conveniently committed suicide. The life expectancy for male members of the imperial family is not very great.
But paranoia meets reality halfway most of the time. And there is often some basis in reality for people's paranoid fears. I think in Caligula's case, he had ample reason to genuinely and realistically think that his life was in danger.
But perhaps Tiberius is responsible for more than merely scaring the boy. Shortly after Caligula's 19th birthday, he is summoned to live with his uncle. The imperial household is not in Rome, but on the beautiful remote island of Capri. What happens here is hidden from the rest of the world.
So this is the lighthouse that Tiberius had constructed. It's over 100 foot tall. It's an extraordinary feat of engineering, and yet ultimately it's just a single light, and this was the only means he had to communicate with the empire.
Certain facts are clear. While traditionally the great men of Rome believe that with power comes duty to the people, Tiberius has turned his back on the city, traded it for a private world where he has no responsibility. where his every desire is catered for. He teaches Caligula that all that matters is what the emperor wants. This is a place of unimaginable luxury, where 12 pleasure palaces sit amongst lush gardens. To be here is to be surrounded by the wealth of an empire. But the threat of death hangs over everything. Between Tiberius's lighthouse and the largest of the palaces on Capri is a cliff with a 1,000-foot drop. It's said that anyone who offended Tiberius, on even the slightest grounds, could be thrown down from here. If they survived the fall, their bones would be broken on the shore. This is the life that Caligula witnessed.
It's interesting to think about what the experience of being on Capri in Tiberius's entourage might have done to Caligula. He has this very kind of paradoxical apprenticeship for power.
It was once standard practice for a young, noble Roman to spend his early adulthood learning the business of ruling, time in the military, in the Senate, in the law courts. What Caligula had was 7 years as a virtual prisoner in paradise. He survived where others perished. But what he learned from his uncle, his only role model, was cruelty, selfishness, and self-indulgence without consequence.
Tacitus talks a lot about the unreadability of Tiberius. No one can work out what on earth he's thinking, what on earth he really wants. There's a kind of family resemblance in more than one sense.
The trauma that Tiberius inflicted here, and in Caligula's childhood, was later to be passed on to the people. It's from Capri that Caligula set out to claim the imperial throne. And the man who arrives in Rome 25 years old, but an alien in the city that he now owns, is clearly damaged. Elizabeth Ford believes he displays all the traits of a psychopath.
And that is a real inability to empathize with others, to follow rules or to want to follow rules, repeated criminal acts, glibness and superficial charm, lying, deceitfulness, narcissism, and that colloquially is just an inflated sense of self. But certainly psychopathy would explain a lot of his behavior.
A diagnosis of psychopathy would explain Caligula's extraordinary success in charming people.
There have been many psychopaths historically, and it's one of the diagnostic features that they are able to be charming when it's in their own interest. And Caligula was noted to be this way for about 6 to 8 months. That's it.
In this reading, the facade would only be maintained for as long as was necessary. Perhaps the monster who had emerged from supposed illness was merely the real Caligula, finally showing himself. Now, nothing held him back. And there were no depths to which he would not sink. In this vault is a vast collection of coins from Roman history. Among them is evidence for perhaps the most powerful relationship in Caligula's life.
Coins were the mass media of ancient times, and when an emperor chose an image, it had real meaning. This one is minted by Caligula himself. Here's his portrait. But we can take a closer look at what is on the other side.
These are images of Caligula's 3 sisters, along with their names, Julia, Agrippina, and Drusilla.
First of all, it's the first time living women appear on Roman coins. And the second thing is, he's underlining there's a specific, special relationship that he has with them.
Caligula has endured the deaths of his father, mother, and brothers. It's hardly surprising then that he develops a powerful bond with the only members of his family who survived. It's said that he's particularly devoted to a sister, Drusilla.
He had honours paid to her, so she's given a very special status and treated as this divine being, and there were orders that she should be worshipped all over the Roman Empire.
The fact that Caligula appears genuinely to have loved his sister is key to any psychiatric diagnosis. It makes it hard simply to write him off as a psychopath.
He at various times had strong feelings for people close to him. That would be inconsistent with someone who had psychopathy, because one of the hallmarks of that illness is a real lack of social connectedness, a real inability to care and develop emotional closeness with any other people.
But no ancient Roman writer sees anything positive in Caligula's bond with his sisters. They interpret it as sexual perversion.
Rumor has it that he sleeps with them.
There are indeed stories that suggest that Caligula had incestuous relations with all three of his sisters. Other stories see the relationship as being particularly with Drusilla, and there are stories that their grandmother Antonia, and this is before Caligula becomes emperor, that their grandmother Antonia had found Caligula and Drusilla in bed together in her house.
It's impossible to ever know the truth of these stories. Some writers seem keen to blacken his name in any way possible. But Caligula's reign is marked by sexual depravity. A flood of tales issues from the palace that he sets up a brothel there with noble women forced into prostitution. That he sleeps with men as well as women, among them the husband of Drusilla. And that he regularly orders the wives of senators to parade in front of him. By any standards, Caligula's behavior is extreme, unjustifiable. But can it be explained? It may have all begun in the 7 years that Caligula spent as his uncle's virtual prisoner.
There are certainly some very unpleasant stories associated with Tiberius's time staying on Capri. It's a kind of hotbed of perverse sexual practices.
The ancient accounts paint Tiberius as a serious sexual predator, abusing men, women, slaves, and children. Everything that happened on the island was geared towards his pleasure. Caligula had spent his early adulthood in a world where the normal rules did not apply. Only the whim of one old man. Did that completely warp his way of thinking?
I would anticipate that seeing the sex and the theatrics and the cruelty, perhaps allowed him or encouraged him to feel that that was appropriate, and that that might be a way, an acceptable way, to rule an empire.
Tiberius is the key. He has taught Caligula that total power brings total freedom. There's no idea of duty or responsibility or mercy. To be an emperor is to be above morality. And as Tiberius made Capri his playground, so Caligula does the same thing with Rome.
Tiberius is alleged to have said about Caligula, "I am nursing a viper for the Roman people."
Some reports say that Caligula demonstrated what he learned by hastening the aged emperor's demise. He simply couldn't wait for him to die. If he was involved, he did it with the complicity of the emperor's personal guards, the Praetorians. Not quite 4 years later, as Caligula's behavior spirals out of control, the same force will turn its blades on him. Caligula's reign is almost 4 years old. Incredibly, he's still adored by the people.
The stories about Caligula not taking the Senate seriously, going off with their wives, putting them in their place, those are stories that might actually have boosted popularity amongst the common people of Rome.
But those close to the heart of government know the truth. Over those short years, Caligula has dragged Rome down. The imperial coffers, once filled with unimaginable reserves of gold and silver, are all but exhausted. And the wounds he's inflicted on the Senate run deep. Its members were once the most powerful men on earth. Now they live in fear. They watch on, helpless as their wives are taken from them and their colleagues are killed. The paranoia which came on Caligula so suddenly and without reason is now justified. Some kind of plot is to be expected because the people who know him know he has to be stopped. He restricts his movements and surrounds himself with men from the Praetorian Guard. When an attempt on his life does come, it's from among their ranks. It's said that a number of plots from among the senators and the city's other aristocrats all merge into one. But the man who finally takes action is a captain of the guard, called Cassius Chaerea. He's an old soldier, a decorated man who fought under Germanicus, Caligula's father. His motives are unclear. Some say he wanted to restore the Republic, some that he had been publicly mocked by the Emperor. But on the 24th of January, 41 AD, he lies in wait in an underground passage on the Palatine Hill. The site has only recently been uncovered. It's now being excavated for the very first time.
In passages like this, the servants of the palace went about their daily duties. They helped to make the palace work and function like a well-oiled machine. So when Caligula came down here, he moved out of the public eye. Caligula was frightened. He tried to hide from the world. He tried to keep himself away from potential threats from potential assassins. But they found him anyway. In a flurry of blows, he died down here in secret.
As word of what has happened spreads, Caligula's body is hastily cremated. But the plotters who thought there would be an end to tyranny, a return to the Republic, and the rule of the Senate, were wrong.
We're told that the news of the assassination was met with grief by the general populace, and they assembled in the Forum demanding that the assassins be brought to account.
They want a new emperor, and again it's the guards who act. They cast around for a candidate, and the man they settle on is one of the few members of the imperial family not to die at Caligula's hands. His uncle Claudius, 50 years old and in ill health. He's only alive because no one ever saw him as a threat. But Claudius knows how to play the crowd. He begins by having Cassius killed using the sword that killed Caligula. Then he seeks to sever the ties that bound the people to his predecessor. This aqueduct bears his name.
The Apple Claudia is a marvelous engineering wonder, and Claudius is the one that completes it and gets the credit. But it was started by Caligula. If the inscription on the aqueduct bore the name of Caligula instead, the people would have honored his memory every day.
In the end, the love of the people was all that Caligula had, and after his death, even that was taken from him. The generations that followed blackened his name and cursed his memory.
I think we do need to think of him as someone who has attracted to himself the most extreme of the stories of tyrannical emperors and has become, if you like, a kind of touchstone for what it is to be a bad emperor.
Caligula brought destruction upon himself. The truth of his reign is buried beneath a layer of myth-making and propaganda. But psychiatrist Elizabeth Ford has seen enough to offer a likely diagnosis.
The top one that I would be considering would be bipolar disorder. It's also commonly referred to as manic depression. And in bipolar disorder, you have a person who typically cycles from mood states, so from a very elevated, creative, not sleeping, not eating, talking very fast, psychotic, manic state, to a depressed state. It's entirely possible that this mysterious illness that happened when he was 26, where everyone thought he was going to die, was a depressive episode. And perhaps they thought he was going to die because he was suicidal.
The manic phase of this disorder would account for his grandiose schemes and many of his excesses. It would produce both paranoia and violent mood changes. Coupled with the trauma of his childhood and the warping effect of his time on Capri, it may be that his affliction doomed him from the start.
My guess is that had Caligula not been murdered at the time he was, his illness would have progressed to the point where he would have either committed suicide or he would have been murdered by somebody else. I think, unfortunately, Caligula was on the road to destruction, and whether that was self-destruction or not, he was not going to make it in the state that he was in.
Few men in history have wreaked as much havoc as Caligula did. But few men have had such opportunity. Rome's senators suffered at his hands, but they'd made him. They took a damaged, ill-equipped boy and gave him power without limits. They couldn't rein him in. They couldn't guide him. In the end, they had to kill him. They had endured years of fear, and yet within hours of his death, they'd again handed the state to the control of a single man. Caligula was cruel,